friends. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm your host, Zen Garcia.
And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. Welcome, friends. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Secrets Revealed here on Truth Frequency Radio. As always, it's a great honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you to share fellowship and to introspect into these strange and awkward times. I'm joined this evening by author Gary Wayne. He's written the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and if I'm correct, will have his next production released to the public soon, hopefully. Gary, are you there, brother?
I am so happy to be back with you again tonight, and yeah, I'm not done the sequel to the Gen 6, but I'm on chapter 72. I do promise it will be less than the 98 chapters of the first book, but I'm hoping to close it off at somewhere around 80 to maybe 85 chapters, and hopefully by the fall.
Getting close. That's awesome. It's a good feeling to come to completion on a huge project like this. You've been working diligently for several years now, if I'm correct, or actually since the last finished.
Well, I started another book that I set aside that I'm about 300 pages in, and I was, really struggling with it, and I think it was I was maybe trying to do the wrong book at the wrong time, and I said I would never do a sequel to the Gen 6, but getting the feedback from people on social media, doing shows, taking questions, getting emails, is that I realized that people, particularly Christians, really wanted to go deeper, and they wanted to go deeper inside the Bible, and they wanted to know how it connected throughout the Bible and obviously into prophecy and end time prophecy. So I thought, I probably should listen to what the audience is saying, and so I've set the second Exodus book aside, and I started on this, and I'd done a lot of research on it previous, but just for my own kind of, enjoyment, and there was a lot of things that I took out of the first book, so that's kind of the basis, but when I laid out the outline for my book, I found, just like in the first book, what I thought I wanted to do isn't what I ended up doing. It's like you're led to do different things and more doors kind of open up. So it's becoming a little bit bigger project than what I had first anticipated. But, I've had so much fun. So whereas the book that I set aside, I wasn't having fun with it anymore. So it was just like I was trying to push a rock uphill. So and I think what I've learned through this process is that I needed to do this book first, and I see a better vision in terms of why I was struggling with the book I was currently working on. So once I have this one done, I'm going to revamp how I did the first the second book that will actually probably be the third book, and start putting that back together in a way that I think is better targeted to the audience I'm trying to hit with it.
And I think, the topic that you were writing on with the Genesis 6 conspiracy and all that it entailed, all the chapters and all the information, that really there's so much more coming out by so many people, so many new collections of manuscripts, New Testament Apocrypha, the Thracian Chronicles, all this material to consider. And so there's a lot to follow up on. And then I'm sure with all your interaction now, and especially with all the AMAs that you've done with the listening audience and having them field certain questions, that it definitely gives you an idea as to what people are interested in and what they want to know more about. And so, yeah, so that's, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I think that's really what kind of convinced me to rethink what I was doing and maybe get back to what I think the audience would like to see more of. And I really liked the work that I did in the Gen 6 conspiracy in the first book, but it was targeted at Christians, yes, but it was also designed to try and bring in people from other belief systems, other religions, and just have maybe encourage them to have a look at what the Bible might have to say, because of all the different things that intersect with all of the other different religions that are out there and all the history that we have, that it's directly sort of related, and that if they did, they might actually be very impressed with what's in the Bible. So I was trying to reach people with that, and I still do a lot of shows uh, targeting that audience because their thirst is high as well. Not
Yeah.
as easily sort of convinced in terms of becoming a Christian, but absolutely astonished what the Bible actually has to say on some of these things.
Right.
And so I continue to try and plant seeds into those audiences, and particularly working in prophecy, because that to me would be one of the key things. If you can connect prehistory to prophecy, you can explain it a lot better, but you can also cross over and plant seeds with people when they start to see some things that maybe you want to have a closer look what the Bible has to say on this.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important because of this whole movement towards um, accepting the ancient aliens as the creators of humanity, and that there's a lot of really even PhD scholars that have embraced this whole theology and are running with it. They believe that all of the teachings of the Sumerians, that this is the oldest writings and the oldest things to consider, and that the Bible is plagiarized from a lot of that, which I know now with all the Thracian material that's come down, that this is actually incorrect. But there are many, many people that are jumping on board with the ancient aliens bandwagon, and that are accepting, buying into, and even teaching the same thing. And I think that the Catholic Church is on board with this theology as well, and that they have certain factions within them that are pushing this. And so I think you're revisiting and reconsidering, and then also bringing forth the truth, the veracity of the word, and how it can really help people to understand in a larger, bigger picture sense of the manner what's really going on behind the scenes and how it's all been laid out. Because as you said, it is all in there. The war between the giants and the bloodlines and the hybrids and all that came forth from the interdiction of the angels and the watchers with the daughters of um, humanity, the going after strange flesh. It's all there. It's just that not enough people really know about it or hear about it. And so I think definitely
Well,
it's important work.
that's that's exactly it. You raised so many good points in what you were talking that I want to underscore a few of them. I mean, first thing is the way of the world and the wisdom of the world is anything but God. So anything
Right.
but what's in the Bible, people will tend to accept. So something that people wouldn't have accepted 50 years ago because our technology and advancement is moving forward now is the more easily believed ideology as in terms of the ancient alien mythos and philosophy that's out there, and their history in terms of how it meshes into what the Bible says, but they have obviously an alien take on it, which is a lower threshold of being than what the angelic rebellion is. So it's just interesting that people will latch on to anything as their first choice than trying to reconcile what might be in the Bible. So I think that's such a very valid point. And the other thing that I think is very, very important is that that's the case within the church too, in too many cases. And so I think churches for the most part teach a lot of good values and things, but they don't teach prehistory and prophecy. And so in those voids, Christians don't have a context for what's being taught to them. Yes, there's good principles there. They're terrific principles and lessons to be learned, but they're not getting the context, and they're not understanding why we're truly here. Absolutely amazing how many Christians will come to me and say, I just don't understand what this whole thing is all about. Well, it's in the Bible if you actually sort of dig into it. But because the churches aren't teaching prehistory and prophecy and haven't, and I think they've been infiltrated at the seminary schools, both in the Roman Church and in Protestantism, that you're just not to touch on that because it's not sort of safe ground. It's too speculative. You could be wrong. But if you stick to what's in the Bible and you're not doing things with a preconceived agenda, you're going to be fine. But they don't teach it. So the people that they're communicating with every week and throughout the week, they're not filling the void and the hunger for what's going on in this world, because everybody thinks that something isn't quite right here, and that we're speeding in a direction, but we don't know what that destination is going to be, and we don't know whether or not we can keep the vehicle on the road to get to whatever that elusive utopia is that tends to be what is always promised by polytheism and secularism in terms of however they want to accommodate that. So that void is open. So and it's open because the ministers aren't familiar and the priests aren't familiar with prehistory and prophecy because they're not taught about that. And I'm sure you get a lot of ministers, I know I do, looking for the material on this because they weren't taught it, but they know that something's not right in terms of what they were taught in terms of ignoring these things. It just makes no sense that if it's in the Bible, why wouldn't you talk about it? Why wouldn't you rely on it? And so I think they've left their parishioners open to deception and open to all of this other ideology, and they have no ability to respond to it. What they do know is the world is a mess, and they see things like the pestilence that happened in the last few years, or they see what's going on with the geopolitical sort of new world order, world government sort of thing that is just kind of like monster-like in terms of its incantations and how it's not really moving forward in terms of how the West would like it. And there's obviously a lot of powers out there that would like to see something different, and it's really, really messy. And then that gets messy within North America, within our politics, and we end up with an ideology out there that is so fanatical that it's hard to believe, unless you understand end time prophecy, how so many people could be bought into such. I'll be as generous as I can, into an ideology of extremism and intolerance that doesn't accept any other ideas, and it doesn't have an obligation to have facts. It just says whatever it wants to do, and it controls so much of the power, it just imposes that. I think you can only push so far, but in the meantime, they're preparing people to accept something that is going to be absolutely the most destructive thing that's ever possessed this earth, at least in the time since before the flood.
Right. Yeah, and we're having a revisit of those days of Noah and a return of a lot of that high technology, like the fallen angels are leading us to a rediscovery of things that have been lost. Because certainly, when you examine the prehistory and the antediluvian times and the technology and the capacity that they had, certainly there was definitely something lost in those times. And it seems like there's an acceleration in this generation for a lot of new technologies being rediscovered and a lot of truths that have been lost in coming forward to light again as well. And I think that people are seeking to better understand. They see, all the ancient mysteries and discoveries and can't quite make sense of all these cyclopean sites and all the antiquated, megalithic structures and their alignment to the stars. And then the whole theme of the ancient aliens seeding us and that they're coming back at some point. It's confusing. And then when the seminaries and the Sunday schools and the sermons don't provide answer to give people an understanding of how to make sense of the bigger picture, it certainly leaves doors open to confusion. And so, yeah, I think that the work that you're doing and helping people to come to better discernment on how these things fit together is very important. And certainly, I think that we are in those times where there is this need amongst the church and believers to find a better answer than what they are being given, or there's like a lot of just hush hush and silence when it comes to true direction and guidance. So,
Well,
I'll let you comment,
yeah,
Gary, and then we can go into whatever
sure.
you would like to. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think if we just look at the pestilence that we've had in the last few years, and if we look at the lack of leadership from the churches, and that it was totally steamrolled by science and the secular system and the push for transnationalism and bringing down borders and setting up things that will bring on this new world order that I know the proponents of the new world order are really upset. They've been trying to speed this thing up for 100 years. They can't seem to speed it up, and it's because they don't know that they can't get it done until the restrainer is removed. But that's a different story. But it's important to understand these things that are going on, because and this pestilence is small by comparison for the pestilences that will be coming, or the earthquakes that will be coming, or the famine that will be coming, or the wars and the rumors of war that will be coming. This is just the beginning of the sorrows, and that they're going to get stronger. And if the leadership of Christianity has been this bad in something that is light and comparative to what's coming, we will not have any leadership except leadership that is going to drive us into the globalist arms and into, eventually, if we're still alive, and reach that point of taking the mark of the beast. And we're seeing the birth pangs, if you will, of the persecution and the tribulation that's going to go on. And I think there's a tribulation that is more than is talked about for the last 3.5 years, which is the great tribulation of the world, not seen since the creation of the earth, which probably is more of a reference back to the angelic rebellion than the flood, because the earth was created before the flood. So you have a tribulation, which is the word affliction in Matthew 24, which is Philippians, which is the same word that's used for tribulation in the second half after the abomination and the signs that he provides. And you have a 3.5 year tribulation there that's recorded in Revelation 7 in the saints, but there's going to be tribulation even before that because it gets stronger. It works in, I think, in the pattern of the birth pangs. And so Revelation 2:10 talks about 10 days of tribulation. And that is at the timing of the rising of end time Babylon, which is, more than a show in itself to talk about Babylon. But it's this universal religion that's going to be controlling the 10 kings of the end time, because she rides the beast of empires and she rides the end time beast that's part of that beast of empires talked about in Revelation 13, 12, and 17. So we're going to get a tribulation before the last 7 years, before that covenant that is talked about in the book of Daniel in 9:27. And we know these are the end times, and it's a full week that's allotted. So a week is 7 days, and a day is a year, and a lot of prophetic allegory, just as Revelation 2:10 talks about 10 days of tribulation. Everything works around that 7 year and half of that 7 year numerical equation throughout Daniel and throughout the book of Revelation and throughout the signs that Jesus delivers in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and Luke 21. And they all work in perfect harmony if you let it, and if you put everything around what Jesus said and not vice versa. But if that's the case, that there's 10 days worth of tribulation, then you're going to have significant tribulation with the rise of Babylon before it even sets up the 10 kings and the world government. And if there's significant tribulation to be documented 3 years before, then that means the persecution that we're seeing now is going to continue to rise alongside of these catastrophes for all of those who stand against the New World Order and the rising universal religion. And it's going to go from taking away rights and putting people in some cases in jail without, lawyers and healthcare and stuff like that. And this is going on in North America, and doing things only permitted through martial law or the breaking of the Constitution. That is nothing compared to what will be coming, and that's nothing to what the tribulations are all about. So we need to have some honest conversations within the Christian community, that we can also not only role model what a Christian is, but also be inviting to people to want to learn about what's in the Bible and learn about prophecy, and maybe come to Jesus and to God, so that they won't be taken away before they've had that chance, because it's not about, as some people would think, about not being here for the last 7 years. It's going to be bad before that, and we need to understand that. And depending on what part of the world you're living in, it could be worse than other places, but I think the whole world is affected in ever increasing quantities of catastrophes as we go.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the impact is much larger and much broader. And certainly when we come back from break, we'll consider those things as we start to speak about the war with Russia and Ukraine and end times, and how all that is affected, because even those things are going to be impactful here, even in the United States, when people don't realize. But the outreach of, as you said, the birth pains and the sorrows, that is all coming down the line, and the supply crunch. And I think also there is an identity crisis, as far as amongst Christians, and that things need to be more discussed and considered. And a lot of people, I think that at the same time that there's a lot of people that are lost and struggling, but there is an awakening. There are people that are inquisitive and that want to know different and better. So there is, that.
Well, and that's the opportunity that is out there for the Christian
Right.
community to not only reach Christians and prepare them not to be deceived, but to plant seeds and reach people. But we have to do it in a way that we're not appearing elitist, and we have to be able to role model, and we have to be right. There's
Right.
so much issues that go on in Bible prophecy in terms of all the different types of, I get asked all the time, what's your eschatology? I'm going, what the heck does that mean? They said, well, are you a preterist or what are you? I'm going, that's not how prophecy works. That's a preconceived conclusion. What you do is you put everything around what Jesus said, don't include inconvenient passages, and let it tell the story itself, and you're probably not going to have any issues. So we need to do that so we don't get it wrong, because any group that is putting up one single sort of doctrine that is sort of the whole pinnacle to end time prophecy is probably going to come to a fall. And there's a few largely accepted doctrines on that will discredit Christians en masse when the world needs us the most.
Absolutely. Also, are you, well, I'll ask you on the other side. We'll be right back, everyone.
Your partnership with Sacred Word Publishing goes further than the publishing of ancient manuscripts and weekly video content.
You also make a huge impact across the earth in orphanages in Myanmar, India, Uganda, and Kenya.
Your support is crucial for the development of the ecclesia of real truth seekers.
We thank you for joining us in hosting Secrets Revealed, Momentary Zen, the Digital Readers Club, Ask Me Anything series, and other shows that have helped lead so many to the truth of salvation.
To become even more involved, please visit patreon.com/sacredwordpublishing, where you can partake in exclusive, interactive, patron-only content and help us continue shining the light of love in this darkened world.
When Justin and I found out we were having a little girl, we named her Eliana and started dreaming of what life would be like with her, where we would take her, what we would teach her, and of course, what we would read to her. One day we walked around a bookstore looking for books we might want for her and found nothing. So we started brainstorming what exactly we would want. Even from a young age, we wanted her to know and understand the heart of God and hidden truths that are in ancient biblical manuscripts like the Book of Enoch, and the idea of the Prophecy for Children series was born. Justin got hard to work and praise Yah released the Prophecy for Children series. We are grateful for the support and amazing feedback from others who have been wanting the same for their children. We just found out we will be having a son, and we are excited to grow our family and to keep writing books for our children to share with our truth-seeking family. To order these books today, please check out the children's store at sacredwordpublishing.com.
We're intrigued by the sun, moon, and stars, and imagine there's got to be planets like ours. So conceive of a face on the surface of Mars, so in need of a meaning and purpose we lost. And indeed they believe that these might be our gods, or that maybe with time we'll do right and evolve and eventually reach what they seek and then solve all the problems of man. But they really don't know that they fall, and the works of our hands are but just filthy rags. So we travel the lands to dig up our past. Time elapses, and with it are much of the facts. Some imagine that gods came in alien class. They react in this way, they're so desperate for me.
All right, welcome back, everybody. The final question that I wanted to ask you, Gary, was are you examining any new collections of material coming out? New, like there was a recent release of New Testament Apocrypha. I was just kind of wondering what your focus was on the studies that you're doing, and if there was anything cool that you had recently uncovered or come to light in your research.
Yeah, I mean, I've been so focused on the research for the sequel and for the second Exodus book that I've not had, time to sort of venture into a lot of that new material that's starting to come out. I think it's, it'll be very interesting when I get a chance to go through it. But for the sequel, I was more focused to trying to bring out for people what's actually in the Bible, because there's just so much material in there, and I'm only sort of bringing in outside sources where it seems to be applicable to have a little bit better understanding as to what the spurious forces are doing and how that mixes into either prehistory or to end time prophecy. So no, I've not had a chance to work on some of those projects. There's one thing when you're a researcher, there's always an endless list of things to research if you truly have a passion for it. But time is the worst enemy. So no is the simple answer, I think, to that.
Yeah, no problem. Really quickly, your website.
Obviously, I am coming across new material, but
yeah, of course. Yeah, and specific to your research, absolutely.
Yep.
And so you're thinking fall, and so if you would just give out your contact, social media, whatever you'd like to share, and also your your website, and then we'll move into the subject.
Yeah. So my website, it's going to remain the same because it'll be branding under the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. The website is www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's the Genesis 6 with the number 6 conspiracy.com. And on the website, you will get generous excerpt of all 98 chapters of the book, so you'll get a good feel for whether or not that's a book for you. And I think going through the table of contents is probably going to get your attention, and I get a lot of feedback from people saying this is, the best reference book that I've ever had, and next to the Bible, if it's a Christian, some people will say it's probably the best book that I have in my library. So, and not to diminish anybody else's research, but it just covers so much information and so much ground that that people sort of like it. But that'll give you a good feel for it. And if you're interested in a signed copy, you can get that done by clicking on Buy Now, and you can order a signed copy, or you can link over to barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com or amazon.ca, or over to the Kindle version where it's available in digital. And I also have an overseas page up on the website I put up this year as well, because I get so many requests for shipping overseas. So lots of ways to get a hold of the book and to find out about my book if you're interested or like what I'm saying. And that the second book will be on that same website. because I'm looking at the name as the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2 with the subtitle Prehistory and Prophecy. So we'll be branding it in the same manner. And if you want to get a hold of me, if I mention a document tonight, or if you're looking for information on something, if I've got a document on it, I will send it to you. I do not charge for that. So you can get a hold of me and ask me a question, ask me for more information, and it may take me a couple, 3 weeks to get back to you, but I will get back to you. I just get a lot of email every day. My only social media that I'm working right now is Facebook, and I'm hoping social media sort of settles out in a way that I can maybe take on, one or two other places to work with. But I mean, just answering email and Facebook and Messenger is almost a full-time job. So it takes a lot of time to maintain other social media. So, but hopefully there'll be another one that I can see that would be beneficial to getting information out. So those are the best ways to get a hold of me, and the best ways to get a hold of the book. And if you wanted to support your local bookstore, you could order the book in for them through your local bookstore, and I encourage supporting your local bookstore. It's distributed by Bookmasters for my publisher, and they can order it in on one of their orders.
All right, brother. Well, let me go ahead and turn it over to you to let you lead us into the discussion for this evening. Definitely want to give you time to present, the things that you would like to bring forth to the audience, and I will jump in with questions, or to ask you about things that you bring forth in discussion. So,
yeah, we're going to talk tonight about Russia and what is going on with Russia and what is going on with China, and how that fits into end time prophecy. And for people who may not be all that familiar with end time prophecy, I kind of like to give the three overarching signs that Jesus provided for us in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and 21. And the first one comes later on in the signs that he's providing for the disciples who asked for the signs of when he would come and what the signs of that would be and the coming of the end time. So they want to know when he comes and the end time and what are those signs. And the fig tree generation is such an important one. And the fig tree generation is a specific generation. And, we don't know exactly how long a generation is. The book of Exodus says 40 years. You get the book of Psalms that says 70 years. I also like to look at Genesis 6:3 as 120 years. And so there is a generation, and it doesn't have to take the whole generation. So it doesn't have to, go a whole 120 years or a whole 70 years. But it's that fig tree. And, Jesus, when he was with us, he actually, before he gives the decant on the signs, he actually kills a fig tree. And it's a sign for people. And in biblical prophecy, you have Israel and Judah. One's the northern kingdom, Israel, one's the southern kingdom, Judah, that have specific prophecies for them. And they have allegories, prophetic allegory for them. And the church has their own set of prophecies as well, but that'll be all brought back together as a whole, at the Supper of the Lamb in Revelation 20. So all the factions will be reunited by then, but we're going to be sort of getting there. But in the prophetic allegory, Israel tends to be the vine of the garden, and Judah tends to be the fig tree. And shortly thereafter, Jesus provides the prophecy of Jerusalem being turned over, the temple being turned over, not one stone will be left upright. And so we need to look for the fig tree as part of the clue to the prophetic allegory for the end time. And Judah is that fig tree. And we have Judah, whether or not all the people of Judah today that we see visibly as Jewish people around the world are the pure remnant of the southern kingdom, or there's a whole bunch of other people in there. That's not really important. What's important is there's a core of Judah that is in there that God will stand up for. And so, we have them declaring their independence in 1947 and the battle to win it in 1948. So a lot of people were sort of looking for that. I tend to look at another event that if we are in the fig tree generation, what would that start of that generation be? And I don't look at the founding of visible Judah, as I like to call them, because lost Israel, the northern kingdom, is still lost into the nations. They're going to be awakened and called back in the end time, but we don't know who they are, but they will be called by name when they are awakened, and that'll happen in the last 7 years with their exodus in the second half of the last 7 years, along with visible Judah. And so when we look at Israel today, there's a large percentage of people from the southern kingdom. And as I said, God will fight for them, fight for that remnant as we get into the last 7 years. And so this is the fig tree that is blooming, but it's in Jerusalem where that fig tree was killed. And it's now blooming again in Jerusalem since 1967. So if there's a start, and if we are indeed in the fig tree generation, and I do think that we probably are, then that would be the start gate. So, if it's 40 years, we're kind of past that. If it's 70 years, there's still a window till about 2037. I know a lot of the Jewish people think from about 2017, we're in the Messianic period. So we could be zeroing in on that. And if it's 120 years, we may have a little bit longer. And there's a lot of things to come together yet. And so the second overarching sign is the days of Noah, and that comes right after the fig tree generation. And Jesus, being the Word of God and the Spirit of prophecy, chooses his words very accurately. You would expect that. And so those are the same words that are in Genesis 9:29 when it talks about the days of Noah. We're 600 years before the flood and 350 years after the flood. And the sign isn't that people are drinking and marrying and we're not expecting the flood. That's part of it. But I think Jesus is encouraging us to look at the whole days of Noah and to learn what happened up to 600 years before the flood and 350 years after the flood, where you have the creation of the giants and separated by the flood, you have the restart of civilization with the 8 on the ark. And we need to learn all about that. And we were talking earlier about lost technology that is coming back. This is lost fallen angel technology that people would like us to believe are aliens, and that's who they're going to represent these beings as, I think, to a large degree to make a case as to, where these people come from. But this is the angelic knowledge, the knowledge of the gods, as they're called in polytheism, that taught civilization, that provided the technology to build things we can't build today, like the pyramids or Machu Picchu. And there's an endless list, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. And that the technology had the ability to destroy and corrupt the world. And that word corrupt is the Hebrew word shakath. And what shakath means is to decay and to ruin and to degrade and to destroy. And so when God said that he brought on the flood, that the whole world was corrupt and he was going to flood the whole earth because it was corrupt, that is more than just the violence that the Canaanites did, more than just the violence that the giants did, more than just the persecution that the giants and their organizational structure in polytheist religion, which is Enochian mysticism, which is the pantheon of the gods that ruled all of the beast empires through history, and still, is the religion of most of the world. this is the system that brought the world to its knees, but they developed the technology and the knowledge that was accelerated by the fallen angels, much like what we're seeing today with this inexplicable advancement of knowledge that nobody can explain. I think we're being fed that knowledge by the fallen angels, and we're getting back to the point where it's going to be like the days of Noah again, before the flood in this case. And so they were able to do things like change the plant genome. They were able to tamper with DNA and create all of these fabulous creatures that polytheism talks about, whether or not it's the centaurs or whether or not it's Pegasus or it's the chimera that they use today. That comes out of Greek mythology, where they're able to put different animal parts on this being. And so this is all talking about DNA technology, and this is the technology that is being developed in medicine today to work at those levels. So it's all part of that ancient knowledge that I think is being fed to us. And we're just catching up to that now, because we can't do the things that they did before the flood. So our technology is not yet there. And the other sign is the beginning of sorrows, which comes at the beginning of his oration that talks about the birth pangs, as I like to call them. The beginning of sorrows means birthing pains. As you take that back to, as it's defined in Old Testament allegory, and that those birth pains will get stronger and more intense as the end of the age comes about. And so we're going to see an intensity of wars and rumors of war, of earthquakes, of pestilence and famine. So much so that by the time you get into the opening of the seals at about the period of the start of the last 7 years, you get 25% destruction of the people and everything on the earth. And the trumpets are 33% and the wrath bowls are 100%, except that Jesus shortens the days and steps in to prevent all flesh from being destroyed. So things will go progressively worse. But everything works around these birth pangs that Jesus provides us. So in the end time, we're told that there's going to be a universal religion that rides the empire of empires past, and the seventh empire, which rises out of the Roman Empire. The other empires, for people who aren't familiar with it, as the beast empires, would be Babylon, as it's listed first in Daniel 2 and 7, and then part of this will also show up in Daniel 8. But you have Babylon, and then you have Persia, then you have Medes taking over from that, so it's the Persia-Medes Empire, and then you have the Greek Empire, and then you have the Roman Empire. But as part of the beast empire's qualification is, and this is why it's so important to understand the fig tree generation and the importance of Israel being, or Judah being in Israel, because so much prophecy is centered around Jerusalem and the people of Judah in the end time. And so, and then the second Exodus prophecies with Israel. But you have this epicenter that is important to understand, that Judah is there. And Israel is at the epicenter of so much of the geopolitical problems out there, with the world wanting to destroy Israel from the face of the earth, and to eradicate them at least from the continent land if they can. And so we're going to have a seventh empire, and that's going to be rising out of the old Roman Empire. It's an extension of, and it has, in the metallic dynasties, you have the statue, and Babylon is the gold head, and Rome is the two legs of iron. And just before I complete that thought, just so that people understand that there's an intimate relationship with Israel and Judah, is Egypt is the first beast empire, and that's where Israel was raised into a nationhood, and then you have the Exodus, and then Assyria is the next one, and they are the ones who are going to exile the northern kingdom and dispense them around the world, and then Babylon takes Judah, the southern kingdom, in exile, and then Persia permits the building of the second temple, and then the Greek, all obviously overrun Persia and overrun the Middle East. And you also get an abomination example in the Apocrypha of the Old King James Version Bible of the abominations. So you have that influence as well. And it's that Greek leader in Daniel 8, Alexander, that Antichrist is an archetype of, just as an Antichrist is sort of the successful kings of these empires. He's going to have the 8th empire. He's going to succeed the 10th empire. And of course, Rome disperses the southern kingdom as well. That lasted until 1948 with a successful war of independence to take the country back. And so the Beast Empire will be intimately connected to country of Israel today, where the visible people of Judah are. And so the rising of this empire is an important thing. And so we have what I would call a European-dominated culture of the world through its exploits over the last 400 or 500 years in terms of colonialism and the power that was held by the European countries. They have old bloodlines, old money, old power, and their vision is to bring about this end-time empire. But not everybody agrees with that vision. And in part of that vision, to make it happen, is that the U.S. has to be brought down significant levels in terms of its prestige, because it is too powerful. And you see that today. And it's the globalists that are working to bankrupt America, to bleed it in foreign wars, to destroy the culture, to open up the borders. It's the globalists that want to bring this down. And the globalists in terms of the European-centric ideology. But not everybody agrees with the European ideology. And so if we're going to have 10 kings, we need to understand what those 10 kings are and how this empire is going to come together. And I know we won't get this all in before the break, but we're certainly going to get down some important information here for people to understand what's going on today with the Russian war. And so this empire that has the iron legs produces and extends out of that in the end time. In Daniel 9:26, where it says the end, you take that back to Hebrew, that's the Hebrew word ketz, which means the end time, the end of days, and then you have the last week. That's the last week of all prophecy and vision to be fulfilled before we go into the millennium. This empire is going to rise and extend out of the legs, of the iron legs, and it's going to be partially of iron and partially of clay, and it's going to be an empire that doesn't mix, and it's on two feet of the two legs of the old Roman Empire, and there's 5 toes, which are the 5 toes on each foot for 10 kings. And we get the allegory of the toes in Daniel 2 and the metallic empires. We get the 10 horns in Daniel 7. We also get horns for the Antichrist as being the 8th empire that's going to grow up in the middle in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. And we also get the connection to the kings in Daniel 12, 13, and 17 that matches up perfectly with the Daniel prophecies. So these are 10 kings. Now, these aren't 10 kings that are going to have, be centered in Europe as so many people thought. This is a worldwide empire. And it's going to encompass the whole world. And so these are going to be made up of, in my opinion, in my research, groups of nations. They'll have empires of their own. They're known as trading blocks today. They're known as, and you'll hear this term all the time, spheres of influence. And you can call them what they want, but an empire is made up of more than one country. So these are 10 kings of the empire, and each of those 10 kings are going to have an empire. And
Gary, before we get to the break,
go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, before we get to the break, do you think that the 10 kings has something to do with the way that the United Nations has divided up the world into these 10 regions, like
Yes.
the Pan American Union, the Asian Union, European Union, and
Yes.
things of that nature?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I was
Yes, and
thinking.
it's similar to what the Club of Rome did in the late 1960s with their creation. They divided the world into 10.
Right.
But the Europeans aren't going to get their way. It's not going to be exactly that way, but it will be groups of nations like that. So I would say that, like we're seeing something different with Brexit and with Britain, and we're seeing something different with the U.S. making strategic renewal of relationships with New Zealand and Australia. We might see a completely reunited English empire of English-speaking nations put back together as one of those. That we need to be open to that as just a North American group. But yes, you're going to see some different groups of empires that I'm going to get into after the break, and so that we can understand how that comes about with the birth pangs, and in this case, it's the wars and rumors of wars, and that to bring this about is not going to be through the rules-based ideology of the Europeans. This is going to come through catastrophes. It's going to come through pestilence. It's going to come through earthquakes. It's going to come through famine and wars and rumors of war. And so there's going to be empire building and a rebellion against the European model. And I would suggest that we're seeing what might be part of that imagery being established right now. And talk about that.
All right, we'll be right back for second hour.
Your partnership with Sacred Word Publishing goes further than the publishing of ancient manuscripts and weekly video content.
You also make a huge impact across the earth in orphanages in Myanmar, India, Uganda, and Kenya.
Your support is crucial for the development of the ecclesia of real truth seekers.
We thank you for joining us in hosting Secrets Revealed, Momentary Zen, the Digital Readers Club, Ask Me Anything series, and other shows that have helped lead so many to the truth of salvation.
Become even more involved? Please visit patreon.com/sacredwordpublishing, where you can partake in exclusive, interactive, patron-only content and help us continue shining the light of love in this darkened world.
When Justin and I found out we were having a little girl, we named her Eliana and started dreaming of what life would be like with her, where we would take her, what we would teach her, and of course, what we would read to her. One day we walked around a bookstore looking for books we might want for her and found nothing. So we started brainstorming what exactly we would want. Even from a young age, we wanted her to know and understand the heart of God. and hidden truths that are in ancient biblical manuscripts like the Book of Enoch, and the idea of the Prophecy for Children series was born. Justin got hard to work, and Praise Yah released the Prophecy for Children series. We are grateful for the support and amazing feedback from others who have been wanting the same for their children. We just found out we will be having a son, and we are excited to grow our family and to keep writing books for our children to share with our truth-seeking family. To order these books today, please check out the children's store at sacredwordpublishing.com.
All right, welcome back, everybody, for a second hour. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. I'm joined by author Gary Wayne, and we are speaking about Russia and their connections with end-time prophecy. Real quick question, Gary: how do you see Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, the synagogue of Satan, those who say they are Jews but are not, fitting into the power structure of what's coming forth with world government, the one world order, the one world political, economic, and all that system?
Yeah, and these tend to be the polytheist Jewish people, so Kabbalism and a whole bunch of other groups. I won't go and list them all, but this mystical polytheist group that will be part of that synagogue of Satan. They have an important role in the secret society makeup, an important role, not the dominant role, but an important role. And that they are also having bloodlines that are intermarried into the bloodlines of the Europeans, and I'm going to talk about bloodlines in a few minutes as it connects into empires. And so it's important to remember that Israel was a planned recreation of the state to bring on the end time by the globalists. And understand that this is a transgenerational, transmillennia agenda that they've been working on, and that they know to bring about the end time, which is a destiny that they want, because they want to show down with the God of the Bible. They had to create Israel. And so World War I, World War II, and by extension you get immediately thereafter the state of Israel. That is part of the reward for the polytheists of the Kabbalistic movement in the bloodlines and in the sort of global Gnosticism, as I like to call it. So it's important, and we're going to see that, and they're going to be the ones that will be front and center, leading the Jewish people away to accepting Antichrist as the Messiah. And in reward, they're going to receive the ability to do their sacrifices again for the first 3.5 years of the last 7 years. That begins in Daniel 9:27, and then is stopped by Antichrist when he actually comes to power. Antichrist is the one who negotiates that covenant, and that's part of the pact that this universal religion, which it will take to have to implement that. If you have all of these religious factions, you'll never have the Judaic people doing their sacrifices on a wing extremity or an overspreading of the temple, depending on which English translation that you're talking about. So that's how that fits in. They're going to lead Israel astray, or I'm sorry, Judah astray, to accept the rising Antichrist, but then they'll recognize him as the Antichrist at the abomination, which is the midpoint, and then they're going to flee to the wilderness, even though Antichrist and Satan is going to spew a river at them. God will step up and protect them and hide them in the wilderness to wait for Jesus to exit Israel that has awakened in to meet them for judgment and the resurrection of their own people. That's Ezekiel 37. I know I'm down a large rabbit hole here, but I'm just trying to give some context to understanding that that's part of leading the current Jewish people astray by the polytheist forces. So I mentioned bloodlines, and these bloodlines would have intermarried with some of the European bloodlines, and that's the Davidic bloodline and the King Saul bloodline, and with a lot of the Gnostic literature, let's say with the Da Vinci Code, but it's a standard doctrine belief that Jesus did not die on the cross by Gnostics, that he survived to have children, with the third one being Josephus intermarrying with the kings of Camelot coming out of Glastonbury and down into Wales, and that bloodline crossed over to the Merovingians as it goes with Aragon marrying Amenemhat of the Merovingian bloodline that has been passed down to the European bloodline. So just to give you an idea about bloodlines, but bloodlines is key to understanding the geopolitical politics and empires. Dynasties are made up of bloodlines, and these are the bloodlines of the empires past. These are the bloodlines of the European countries that World War I was fought over, with the Russian Tsars, the Kaisers, the Habsburgs, the Windsors. They were all intermarried. It was one big family civil war.
Yes.
And they take their bloodlines back into history. And so the dynasties of the beast empires are part of the royal bloodlines. But these are Rephaim bloodlines of post-Diluvian giants. And if Nephilim survived, as a lot of people believe, then they were the ones who begat or usurped the kingships and started the dynasties. And so the beast empires are all made up of these bloodlines of the Rephaim. And so if you extend that sort of thought, you end up looking at, and if you buy into that thought, then that the end time empire is going to have these bloodlines, however pure they are, and there may be two different groups of them, but bloodlines and empires go together. And so when we have these 10 groups of empires, we need to be looking at bloodlines. So not only, I mean, when people look at the 13 bloodlines of power in the world, they're confusing that with a lot of times with 13 bloodlines in America, or 13 bloodlines combined of Europe and America, or the 13 pure bloodlines of Europe, of the old bloodlines. But there's bloodlines of these 13 families work within a larger group. They don't always get along. The directionally they want to end up with taking over the world and eliminating Christianity and rebelling against God. But there can only be one bloodline that's going to produce the Antichrist, which is why Jesus warned us about multiple Antichrists. And just as in the epistles of John, we're told there's multiple Antichrists. So we can't be looking at the first one, because that's going to ruin our credibility. We have to be discerning who it's going to be. And when we see Antichrist negotiate the 7-year covenant, he won't be Antichrist yet. And there'll be another one that comes along that I'll touch on later, hopefully in the show, that he will use as his credentials as the Messiah and the Armageddon battle, and an Antichrist figure that he says will be the Antichrist, and promises peace and safety and comes to power at the midpoint of the last 7 years. So if we understand that there's bloodlines around the world from these giants, from the Rephaim, and if the Nephilim, if they survived, and if they started all of the empires past, then we have a better understanding of what might be going on in the world today. We have, for example, the Tsars have fallen, but we have a leader named Putin who is looking to reassert in an empire type of strategy to put together the old Russian Empire. And the biggest prize on that list is Kiev. That's for a reason. Kiev is the ancient home of the Putianin, of the original czars of Russia. And this is a pure Scythian or Tuatha De Danann or Rephaim bloodline. And it is a rival power, and probably one of the reasons why Europeans helped fund communism to overthrow this rival bloodline, because they weren't in, there was some large disagreement that put them at odds. And so we have Russia now without a bloodline, but the name Putin, it comes out of nowhere in about 1850 with his grandfather Spiridon. There is no Putin before that. And that's very, very interesting, because names just don't come out of nowhere. And then a couple generations later, you have him usurping the power of one of the great military nations and resource nations in the world. It just doesn't happen that way. But there was a tradition in Kiev with the original Putyanin bloodline of Tsars. And this is the Putyanin bloodline that established the Muscovite bloodline of Tsars that was taken over by the Romanovs in about 1600. But the Romanovs are intermarried with the Putyanin too, so it's more of an interfamily sort of change. And what's interesting about that is that the Putyanin out of Kiev, they had, and the nobility in that region, they have a tradition that if you have children out of wedlock, you give them part of the name, but not the whole name. And that Putin's name with Spiridon comes out of nowhere in about 1850. And so if you start to think about that, and you start to think about what the motives of Vladimir Putin are, it is much deeper than I want to rebuild the Soviet Empire. He is replacing all of the imagery of the empire past with the double eagles and all of the different types of statues to the great Vladimirs of Russian history. And he wants to have that Russian empire reestablished, and he's pushing back against the European centric model. And it's not that Vladimir Putin, and I'm not defending him in any way whatsoever, I think he's an evil Antichrist type figure. He is pushing back against the European powers and saying, I want a larger role. Just as Trump was pushing back, and again, I'm not equating Trump with Putin, but they were doing the same thing. Trump was pushing back against the Europeans who rose up against them to bring them down with all their wealth and power and influence in the U.S. He was saying, I want a larger role for the U.S. in this new world order, not a smaller role. And President Xi is doing the same thing. And of course, Xi Jinping comes from the Xia dynasty. That's spelled X-I-A, and a short version of that is X-I for the Western Xia dynasty. And these are the dynasties that goes back to the dragon creator gods that produced demigod offspring as the dragon kings that produced the Xia bloodline and all the dynasty bloodlines throughout Chinese history. And that's where Xi's name come from, X-I, as you'll see that spelling, along with J-I, but Xi Jinping. And so this is the bloodline of the ancient Chinese empire. And they'll be exerting and will be exerting their will against the Europeans as well and the Americans, and they will create a larger empire. But as we talk about understanding who the Tsar bloodlines are, we need to understand that this is a migration that comes out of northern Turkey, and you have a group of countries there that are going to be a group of people there, tribes, that are going to be intermarrying with the descendants of Japheth. And so you're going to have names like Magog and Tubal and Gomer and Togarmah, countries like that that are associated, that are going to be within this mix. And so I think what we see happening with Putin is he is exerting his bloodline right back to the Tsars, but back to the Scythians, back to the Rephaim, back to this pure bloodline, that he wants to have a very large role in the end time. And what's interesting, when you look back at some of the history of the Scythians and their migrations, and they migrate in a lot of different directions, and I'm focusing on Russia right now. But the most ancient historians connected the Scythians to being the founding people through the Russians, through the Ukrainian Scythians that started the Tsar dynasties. And in fact, Herodotus, he noted that the Muscovites lived in North Asia Minor, which is in the South Sea Black area, in that area that I was talking about, where all these tribes were. And Josephus said the Muscovy and the Tobalites, which is an important name as well, Tobalites, they were founded by Meshech and Tubal. And again, Tubal is the people that founded the Tubalites, and these are also known as Iberians or Scythians. These are the same branches of the same groups of people. There are 4 different groups of Aryans, but this is one of those groups that migrated up the Danube River and into Germany and into Norway and over into the Ukraine and then into Russia. And also is that it's the Mycenae by these ancient historians that also were founded by Masak. And so all of this connects into the transliteration to make I won't go through all the details on this. I have a document on this if people want to get a hold of me in terms of Putin and his bloodlines and the Scythians and the Muscovites and stuff like that. Understand that it's the transliteration of these names that produces the Moscow name and the Muscovite people. And Mokba is the Romanized version of Moskva, in English Moscow, and named after the Moscow River. In Latin, it's the Moscovia, and it's the old Russian name that's translated from Moskva, which is the Principality of Moscow. And this all has an etymological connection back to Muscovite, which goes back to Meshech. What's important to remember about that as we start to look at these empires, and one of the great wars of the end time is that there's a war just before the midpoint that's called the Gog War in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and it's in the last days, as Ezekiel 38 talks about, and it's before the second Exodus that is included in the 39 detailing, chapter 39 of Ezekiel, detailing of the same war. So it's in the end time, and my timing is the opening of the abyss. And this is, Gog of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech. And Rosh, as you take chief back to, is also part of the etymology for the Russian name as well. So as you take this back to Hebrew, you start to get these ancient sort of connections. But Gog is not part of the table of nations. Magog is, Tubal is, Gomer is, Togarmah is, but not Gog. But yet in this war we have an Antichrist figure as you take Antichrist back to its Greek meaning and to its Hebrew meaning, which the Greek meaning is based on. There's an end time archetypical Antichrist figure named Gog. Not the Antichrist, but one of these Antichrists. And this will be, I think, the war that Antichrist will come to power on, is this Armageddon war, because it's just so huge. This is Gog of Magog, and Gog is not in the Table of Nations. And the Table of Nations is found in Genesis 10 and First Chronicles, and it lists the 70 patriarchs of the nations that descend out of Noah that make up the nations of the world. Magog is in there, Tubal is in there, but Gog is not. So we have this Gog of Magog. And Gog, in polytheism, was a giant son of Iapetus, one of the parrot gods before the flood, as Magog was a giant as well. And Albion, if people are familiar with English history and mythology, all are important in post-Diluvian English history. So we have people and giants named after giants that show up after the flood. And I think probably some of the Japhethites actually took the names of giants like Magog because they intermarried with these Rephaim giants after the flood in Asia Minor. And this is the Gog of Magog, and Magog, again, according to ancient historians, is the founding Scythian people for Russia and the Ukraine. And so we have this great alliance of nations that will form for this Gog war. But before I get into that, and I'll let you back in if you have some questions, Zen, I want to move into what's being made up of in terms of these groups of nations and how that relates to the 10 toes and what we're seeing in the geopolitical and geoeconomic moves that are going on in the public news today.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that. Just a question with regard to Vlad the Impaler and his bloodline, and also the Order of the Dragon. Are they still part of the move and the power line, the power families? Is there still some connection between them and what's going on in this day?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I don't think it's going to be wrapped up in the sort of the Slav bloodline as we would understand that from a generic, general sort of name for the Eastern peoples in North Asia and Central Europe. I think there's going to be a distinction between the central Scythian bloodline. So Vlad the Impaler, he's a Scythian, and he's a purebred member of the Tuatha De Danann. He's your classic red-haired, pale-skinned, hazel-eyed, sensitive to sunlight, blood-drinking, polytheist ritual, educated in a mystery school in Austria, who came to power and was part of the Ordo Draconis to put certain bloodlines back on the thrones in continental Europe and to pursue the knowledge of Thoth, which was the Egyptian wisdom god. And so you have this sort of Egyptian mixing in. So this is a Central European bloodlines that the Anjou are connected with through Hungary, and also into the Western. The Anjou are also connected to the Western bloodlines. There's 3 different branches of the Anjou that will play a role in the end time. So bloodlines are very, very important. I think what is forming with, and what we're seeing forming with the Russian-Ukrainian war right now, as this plays out, is we see Germany doing something they haven't done since World War II. And so I would be looking for a bloodline individual to step forward from there as well. And I think this is Gomer. And again, the ancient historians look at Gomer as being the Scythians who started the German people and the German Empire, as under the Kaisers that they became famous for before the 2 world wars. And we're starting to see Germany put money into defense, and they are so connected to Russia. I don't think they'll be able to cut those ties. And so eventually they're going to partner with this Eastern group. And this is going to split away, I think, the European economic community into two. France will dominate one. Perhaps England comes back to that, or perhaps they go with North America. But Germany will step forward as a world leader again and dominate Central Europe. And that's going to go down into the bloodlines of Vlad the Impaler. And I would also, just for the record, say that Prince Charles says, shows you how much intermarriage has happened in the bloodlines. He says his genealogies go back to Vlad the Impaler. That goes back through the German bloodline of the Hanover. So you see that central bloodline and Scythian sort of makeup that I would expect will reemerge with the Vlad the Impaler bloodline. So yes, I do expect that, and there'll be a mix of the Anjou in there as well through the Hungarian bloodline of the Anjou. So yes, I would expect that. And so I actually kind of think that might even include Turkey, as you look at how that NATO issue is developing, and President Biden had to bribe Erdogan of Turkey to allow Finland and Sweden into NATO. So I'm sure we'll never be told how much treasure was given to Turkey, but it would have been significant because they were dead set against that. And they are leaning heavily towards alliances with Iran and to Russia. So I would expect that to continue as we see the stress fractures of this war in Russia expand. And so we're going to have, as I say, if you look at these empires, you're going to have a Western empire of European, you'll have a central one, and then you're going to have a Russian empire. Now, as we look at this alliance that is going to start this war in Gog and invade the Middle East, that Antichrist is going to rise to power on, this is the time of the 10 kings. So I'm talking about these groups as being kings of these groups.
We are at break, and we'll be right back for the final segment.
Here's the second word, fascination. A bit beyond just simple interest. Interested people are probably satisfied that it ticks. It ticks. And that's good to know. It ticks. But fascinated people want to know what? What makes it tick? Fascinated people aren't satisfied usually with surface information. They've got to know more than just what appears. What is really going on? What's making things tick? What's making things happen? Why do people feel like they do and think like they think? What is the difference between success and failure? Who has the appetite and who doesn't have the appetite? This whole fascination about life and people and circumstances and society and money and banks and churches and sermons and books and records and life experiences and enterprise and nations and color and races and religion. I'm telling you, if you'll take a new fascinated look at life and what's going on, it will now show up in color and sharpness in your future communication.
Extendivite is more than just a heart tonic. Do you have any of these symptoms? Night cramps in the hands and feet. Your arms and legs often go to sleep. On short walks, do your legs get aches and pains? Is your memory worse than it used to be? Ankles that swell late in the day? Has your blood pressure increased lately? If you answered yes to even one of these questions, you may have early warning signs of arterial blockages. Your body is saying that it is time to take Extendivite. These are not the normal signs of aging. They are the warning signs that accompany blocked arteries. Get your Extendivite today. Extendivite is available in capsule or liquid form for just $69.95 for a 2-month supply. To get started, call 1-877-928-8822. That's 1-877-928-8822 or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendivite.
For 5,000 years, the world was ruled with wooden ships by one man. 242 years ago, a small group of free men crafted a new nation built on liberty and freedom. Global elites have been fighting to destroy this new nation called America ever since. Based on actual events, Charm of Favor tells a true story of how they corrupted the election system. They infiltrated federal agencies and murdered witnesses, judges, and even presidents to keep from being caught. Now, the largest and wealthiest crime syndicate the world has ever known has been drawn out of the shadows. They have killed hundreds of Americans and recently attempted to assassinate half our congressmen. Still, they escape arrest through an almost supernatural charm of favor. Read Charm of Favor and be prepared to open your eyes to what may lie just around the corner. Charm of Favor is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
No hate, no hype, no fear.
You're listening to Truth Frequency Radio.
We are TFR.
All right, welcome back, everybody, for final segment. One question for you, Gary, before we move forward. Any idea or thought about Angela Merkel being the illegitimate child of Adolf Hitler? Gary, you there?
Sorry about that. There's a lot of speculation about that, but we don't have any solid evidence to substantiate that. So I mean, it doesn't. Some people think that the 10 kings of these empires, not all of them will be pure bloodlines. That some of them will be more like strongmen. Right. So people who have usurped some of those dynasties. So you could imagine maybe Germany being led by an offspring of Adolf Hitler, but I would tend to, or descendant of Adolf Hitler, I would tend to, though, go with probably, resurgence of the Kaiser bloodline or of the Habsburg Empire bloodline that would take over that whole group. Which probably would make more sense from the claims for the King of Jerusalem title that they have, that is in direct opposition to the House of Savoy, which has another Anjou bloodline that has a claim to it. The title is currently held by the Bourbon family, who inherited it from the Habsburgs. That's King Philippe of Spain. So expect politics to be governed by bloodlines. Just as, when we look at, Putin, I mean, he put up, a statue of Vladimir the Great, one of those first things that he did. And that just shows you that he believes he's from the bloodline of the Rurkud bloodline that goes back to the Putyanan bloodline. And he's symbolizing one of their great conquerors. And Putin's first wife was also from the Putyanan bloodline as well. So it's, absolutely unbelievable that somebody who doesn't have any background that you could take to royalty would be so connected into the royalty that he would actually have a wife of the original czars of Europe from that bloodline, and just of Ukraine from that bloodline. So don't expect Putin to destroy Kiev. It's too important. But he will not stop until he gets Kiev. And that's where you have to start looking beyond the information that the media provides so that you have a better understanding. And he won't stop with just Ukraine. It's going to include all of the Baltic states as well. That's part of that Russian Empire. And probably parts of Finland is what they're, whether or not they actually get that far or not, I don't know. But he wants to put that back. And as we see the cracks being developed in this, we see these groups of nations that are being formed. That, and again, whether or not they're going to be trading blocks or spheres of influence, doesn't really matter how they come together. But you also see a movement with starting to move away from China in terms of the importing, and there'll be tariffs and things like that. The Europeans are already protecting themselves in that sort of manner. So trading blocks are going to become more important and probably going to be a large part of that glue. And it'll be a combination of a military and an economic trade agreement to bring them together. So when we look at other nations of the mix that are going to be working together, by the time of the God War that we talked about, well, we've got the Russians that we've talked about. We've got Gomer, which are the Germans that are going to be working with Turkey in that central sort of a relationship. But Persia is another group that's in there. And that's Iran as we understand it today. So expect them to get a hold of Iraq and some other countries. And it'll be, I can't see that they're going to have, unless they absolutely destroy the Sunni, I can't see them taking over those Muslim countries, but they could destroy the Sunnis and just impose Shiaism over the Sunnis. But they're going to have a play. And we see Iran rising and working with Turkey, working with Russia, working with China in this new alliance of the East that is forming. And we also have to take note of India, who is currently still buying their oil from Russia, who are not talking much about this war at all, and are not supporting the Europeans and the Americans in sanctions or anything like that. And I think you're going to see them move closer to this Eastern alliance as well. This is my just sort of connecting the dots. And where that sort of comes in is there's almost like two Persia. So if you understand ancient Scythian and Aryan history, and Aryans and Scythians are part of the four groups of Indo-Aryans after the flood, which I think are the Rephaim, post-Diluvian giants, for people not familiar with that term. And it comes from the Bible. You get Rephaim in Genesis 15 with the land being promised to Abraham. They're included there, and in Genesis 14 in the War of Giants. And all but four times in the Bible, the word giant in the King James Version goes back to Rephaim. The other three times are Nephilim in Genesis 6:4, Numbers 13:33 twice, and then also in the book of Job, where a giant goes back to Gibborim, which is the word used to describe the giants. The mighty ones goes back to Gibbor, and the male plural is Gibborim on that. So you have these Scythian Aryan people that are moving down after the flood into Mesopotamia and into the Persian area, just as the Persian kings took their bloodlines back to these Aryans. And I have a document on that if people want that as well. But they also migrated into the Indus Valley, into modern day India, and started the Hindu religion, and which is very much related to Zoroastrianism of ancient Persia, because it's the same source religion. And they begat the Indian subcontinent nation. And so you could classify them as being part of the Persians as well. And they could be part of this God war, because if it is the same as the Joel 1 and 2 war, which has the same creatures as the Revelation 9 war, that's a 200 million man war. And that abyss opens up before the before the midpoint of the last 7 years, and seemingly related with Apollyon and Abaddon leading fallen angels and demons that are locked up in the abyss is the 200 million man war, which everybody, when they read Revelation, says, well, that's got to be Armageddon. But remember, Antichrist needs an Armageddon war of his own, and that's the Armageddon war he'll use as the counterfeit Armageddon to take his armies and take credit for winning, and then move his armies into Jerusalem immediately after, as talked about in Daniel 11 and Luke 21. So we see India moving into this Eastern Alliance, and maybe part of that Gog war, which provides a lot of the numbers, because it's a 200 million man army. It's huge. Only China and India has the ability to produce that. Right. So now if we see what's going on, we have this interesting group that's being sponsored by China. You have China and their empire ambitions. I don't think Japan will be part of that unless they're overtaken. I think the Yamamoto bloodline will have a separate Southeast Asia group of nations, but China is the main power, and they're going to take Taiwan and some other countries before they're done, I think, if Xi gets his way, and I think he will. And you have India, and you have Russia, and you have this Central American power, and you also have Iran. And, we also have Ethiopia and Libya that's in that mix as well. So they're going to be in a mix of either one of these groups, probably the Persian group, or they're going to be part of an African group as well. There could be a couple of groups of North Africa and Southern Africa. It's hard to know how that's going to shake out, but the wars and catastrophes will shake that out. What's interesting about that is if you have 5 of those come together, those could be 5 of those kings that are like iron mixing with clay. They're not going to mix well. And there's some different meanings in terms of what iron mixing with clay is, but that is, especially when you get into Daniel 2:42, we're talking about with the metallic empires, you have this commingling of the descendants of these beast empires past who are going to mix their seed with humankind. So it's either purebred giants or it's descendants that will be mixing with humankind, but there's 2 different peoples that could be the iron and the clay. Iron from the beast dynasties, clay from humankind, as you take that sort of allegory back to its original meaning, and Adamites being clay, right? Being made from clay. So, and then when you look at the geopolitical scenario that's going on right now, not only are these countries coming together, but they are saying they're going to develop their own US dollar equivalency. They're going to have their own monetary system. They already have their own World Bank. They already have their own credit card system. You will have to do business with them, as Russia is demanding, with the backing of China, that if you're in Europe, you have to buy oil in rubles, not in US dollars. And so you're seeing this whole geopolitical, militaristic, economic, trading group that is forming with the stress fractures of what Putin is doing to reestablish a larger role for Russia and reestablish the Russian Empire. And he's also being utilized by President Xi to shake out how the world will react so they know what to do. So he's like the lapdog for China, just as the US is the lapdog in many cases for the Europeans. And so you can see the 2 powers that are behind everything that will be moving forward into these 2 feet that have 10 kings on each end. But watch for how birth pangs will be moved forward as well with this Russian war. So as this continues, and it looks like it's going to be dragged out, we're likely to see a shortage of fertilizer and a shortage of food. Now, I know there's I think, 100-day agreement to ship some grain out of the ports of the Ukraine, but the world cannot stand a loss of the food produce out of Ukraine. So if Russia shuts that down, there'll be famine. There's famine, there's going to be pestilence.
Right.
And so it's interconnected. And if this war spreads, if it gets elevated from a proxy war that the West is currently doing to larger weapons, more countries, you could see famine and pestilence and more wars starting with that. And if you have famine going on in the world and too much pestilence going on in the world, you're going to see civil wars all over the world. And we're going to see this pattern of wars and rumors of war that is going to start to coalesce what this 10 groups of nations final look is going to look like. But it's going to take, before that happens, you're going to have a lot of war. You're going to have a lot of catastrophes. But before it can come together, you have to have the universal religion. So as this is playing out, I would encourage, I think, people to watch for the false prophets to come out from Babylon that is going to be promoting this universal religion, and expect them to do contrived prophecies or contrived catastrophes that they know, because all of these birth pangs are contrived. These are all created within the world. It's not God sending these judgments down. It's in my opinion, it's all being done by ourselves, because we end up convicting ourselves through free choice. We have a choice not to follow the way of the world, but most of the world will continue to go down this path of human knowledge, which leads to destruction. And so just as you can imagine more contrived or created pestilences down the road, you could look for things that are being done that could cause more earthquakes. And earthquakes have been on the rise for a number of years. Look for things that are going to drive famine, which is wars and pestilence and economic collapse, and things like that. So these are all going to be catastrophes that are done by the people of the world to each other, but they're going to get stronger as they go. And you're going to have prophets that come out, and there'll probably be prophets from many religions. So it's going to be hard to sort out who the true Babylon ones are, but they're going to be the ones who have control over the power levers to predict, let's say, a nuclear attack or a huge disaster of earthquake and tidal waves that might come with it, because they're part of the power group that's going to cause the calamity, and that this will be the rise of the universal religion with the false prophets, because you have to have that universal religion to be the glue that's going to utilize a relatively unknown person today to negotiate the covenant for the last 7 years. And that 10-king empire that will be formed will secure the safety of Israel in that pact. So expect Israel to be part of wars, perhaps some wars with Iran to take out nuclear capability and things like that as we go, because Israel will be wanting some sort of protection, because they're going to be afraid that this Eastern alliance is going to wipe them from the face of the earth, which the Gog War will eventually do. But to have this happen, you have to have the 10 kings subservient to this end time religion, because she rides the beast. And they actually grow jealous of her, as Revelation 17 talks about, so much so that they hand their power over to Antichrist, who's going to destroy Babylon and then move the religious center to Jerusalem when he's crowned with the abomination at the midpoint of the last 7 years after the counterfeit Armageddon war that I think is the Gog War of Ezekiel 38, 39, Joel 1 and 2, and Revelation 9. And that Revelation 9 has the release of the fallen angels. So we're going to have all of that going on just before the midpoint. Then you're going to have the war in heaven at the midpoint as well, at the time Antichrist is crowned. And all of the angelic rebellion are going to be on earth, and they're going to have a cover story as to who they are, which is that, I think, as we talked about earlier, the alien mythos.
Right.
So what we're talking about here with the Russian war is, I think, the final sort of move directionally through wars and rumors of wars that cause, well, in large part, cause a lot of these other disasters to bring about these 10 kings. And remember that the Chinese are also on record by saying that the next world war will be fought with biological weapons. In other words, the release of disease.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that is, already in process, and certainly a lot of the Hollywood shows and TV programs, they are, predicting that kind of scenario. And it's interesting that the Georgia Guidestones are, now defunct. But one question, and then I'll get you to give final comment. Is do you know about the droughts that are happening in the Southwest, which nobody seems to be talking about, and how the Hoover Dam and also the Glen Canyon Dam are at the lowest levels? They're almost dead pool, meaning they can't produce electricity, and there's no water to send to the 7 states, especially California, which they're growing and have been growing a lot of the food in the same way that Ukraine is the breadbasket over there in Europe. Any comment on that?
Well, I think all of that is something to keep an eye on, and we're not sure what's causing the drought, but at a certain point, it gets to be existential for the people living in those areas. I mean,
absolutely,
you can't have Las Vegas without water in the dam. You can't have California without the water flowing to them. And you combine that with the brownouts and the lack of electricity, and it's almost like everything is being pushed in a direction to make the bubble burst, to cause anarchy in the U.S., whether or not it's the debt, whether or not it's the political issues, whether or not it's the border, on and on and on. It's almost like they're trying to create enough anarchy to move to a one-party system.
The order out of chaos. Certainly. Yep. Well, we've got just a few minutes remaining, Gary, so I want to give you a chance, for final comment, anything that you want to make sure you get to say to the listening audience before we break for the evening. And also, if you will give out your website and contact info once more.
Sure. Just a couple of small little points in terms of some of the connections, and understand that the Scythians and the Tuatha De Danann and all the names of people that I'm talking about, in their belief system, these giants escaped out of Tartarus and into Asia Minor. So the same group location where the descendants of Japheth would have moved and intermarried. I think these are created as giants after the flood, but from a polytheist, historical, and religious and mythological mythos perspective, they escaped out of the abyss after the flood. And that the Mongols were also part of this Scythian group from that same area, and the Russians, or the Rus, the Slavs, the Avars, the Scythians are used interchangeably in terms of the names, and that the Cossacks that were in the Ukraine area, the original Scythians, they were called Tartars, which were a division of the Scythians, and Tartar is a name that comes from Tartarian, and so it's part of the post-Diluvian Tartarian Empire. And again, that whole mix, and there's a lot in the Tartarian mythos that I might disagree with, but Tartarian Empire that reached into the Mongols are all part of this bloodline history, and that the Mongols were actually, Scythians from eastern Russia and Siberia that take their bloodlines back to the Scythian region, and Marco Polo actually referred to them as Scythians. And so when we look at the history that's going to come out on this, we need to be ready for how they're going to spin this in terms of the people that are going to be rising to the top to take over. They don't all have to be bloodlines, but understand there are bloodlines all over the world, and I mentioned a few. I mean, there's names like the Khans and the Singhs in India to keep an eye on. You've got bloodlines that go through the Sunni and the Saudis, which are part of the Sunni. That whole royal bloodlines take their bloodlines back to the Arabs and the Edomites as well. So expect sort of bloodlines of that to come forward as well. Hard to know how that's going to look in parts of Africa, but one might expect an Ethiopian connection that might come out of there coming forward down the road. But you have the Ingaroka, for example, of bloodlines in South America. Many people think that the royal bloodlines were lost with the Spanish conquering of Central and South America. Only the king at that time was killed. The rest of the family remained. And by about 1525, both Portugal and Spain had reinstated all of the original lands and power and privileges of the Incas, of the Aztecs, of the Mayans, all the different nations. And then they began to intermarry with Spanish and Portuguese royal bloodlines. So there's going to be bloodlines there. One of the wild cards is the U.S. bloodline. How does that sort of intermix? But if they become part of the Windsor Empire that goes back to the Hanovers, then you can start to see where that bloodline might come in as well. So keep bloodlines in mind as we see this geopolitical thing shape out. So if you wanted the document on Putin or on Xi, or you want to ask me about documents on the Rephaim or whatever, get a hold of me through my website at the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. That's the Genesis 6 Conspiracy with the number 6conspiracy.com. And go to contact the author, and you can ask me a question or ask me for a document, or if I've got a document on something, and it may take me a couple of weeks, but I will get back to you. You can also, that's the best place to purchase my book if you like what I'm saying. And you also will be able to read a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters. So you'll know whether or not, just by looking at the table of contents and some of the excerpts, whether or not that's the book for you, or get a hold of me through Facebook and Messenger.
We appreciate you, Gary, as always. Be blessed, brother. Good night, all.
Good night.
Censorship and regulation is becoming an ever-growing problem in today's modern media, from the mainstream to YouTube and Google.
Thank you everybody for joining us for this video and this broadcast. We appreciate all of you and thank you for your patronage. Please do like and subscribe and share with your friends. God bless all of you in your seeking.